entitled my talk, No Business in History, No History in Business. So it's a two-part talk. The first explores why there is nothing taught about business in our history programs when business accounts for more than 50% of the economy. The second explores why business in general and business schools in particular ignore the history of business. Today, from time to time, when you read the press, one is tempted to say that there is no history of any kind being taught. Hilda Neatby, who wrote so little for the mind, would be disappointed, and Jack Gravenstein, who wrote Who Killed Canadian History, would not be surprised. How else can you explain the motion of the Ontario Elementary Schools Teachers Association to remove John A.'s name from the schools? Conrad Black described this as the work of underworked, overpensioned teachers' unions. But I also saw a cri de coeur in a letter to the editor from a school teacher last week who complained that history was being erased because of a lack of published material. In spite of these problems, Historica, and Tony, I think I've got this right, annual tracking of history curricula in the public school system is showing positive progress. That's how I read it. Now that is not saying that but the curricula is making progress since Historica was started, Canada's History Society was formed, and there has been some progress in that area. Unfortunately, I do not think that is true at the university level. I spoke to Jack last week, who said the situation was much worse than when he wrote his book nearly a quarter century ago. He went on to add, what little Canadian history that is taught at the university level is taught by Marxist Canadian historians. If I recall, Jack is not known for his right-wing views. He also said I could quote him. A younger scholar I know disagreed. He told me the Canadian historians tend to be transfixed on Canada's history within a global context, for example, colonialism, as opposed to interest in the country's domestic history. Right now, the academic job market in Canada favors international history over domestic Canadian history. So the Canadianists are tailoring their work to meet this demand. American historians, on the other hand, tend to focus on the domestic history of the U.S. because they know they can get hired or get a book deal. Whatever, we all know that social history has become dominant. And as I look around the room, a lot of my fellow board members, who are all academics, are not here, and I'm a little bit disappointed in that. Because somehow social history does not cover business, which to my mind is kind of weird. Last year I attended the Canadian Historical Association annual meeting in Calgary. The keynote speaker was an Aboriginal woman from Minnesota. And I was listening, and she put up a fabulous picture of a map of the Soo Line Railway. And I love railways, especially old railways. And then she talked what it did to the economy, what it did to trapping, to farming, to the wood industry. Weyerhaeuser started in Minnesota, didn't start in the West Coast. And then, when she was done, the president of the association got up and thanked her for this wonderful presentation, which covered all aspects of history: gender, labor, Aboriginal, and I kept waiting for the word business, and it didn't come. I guess it's not a polite word in university liberal arts faculties. So that was a bit distressing. Now, why is business important? Even though I'm a liberal arts grad, I like to quantify things. I can accept the argument that we obviously need more in women's history because they represent at least 50% of the population. But for the 20th century, business represented more than 50% of the population, and it gets 0% in the curriculum. A cursory analysis of Canadian and American history textbooks finds that American textbooks will have 6 times the number of references to business as their Canadian counterparts. When it comes to commerce, the ratio moves from 6 times to infinity. But even in the U.S., there is concern. I'm going to quote Benjamin Forrester just as Red did. When we tell our national story, we tend to focus on disembodied question of ideology, cultural identity, and politics. Too often we relegate business to the margins of the tale, as though merchants, manufacturers, workers, and bankers existed on a separate plane, independent of the major currents of history. And government plays a large role in shaping business. The voting public needs to know how political actions impact business and economic growth. In my course, I use something which we just referred to called the Diamond Growth Model, developed at the Stern School at New York University. Warren went into this in some detail. I'm going to begin with government, because when they say that it's a diamond model, excuse me, they've got a baseball diamond, and since I like baseball, I thought it was a great model. Home plate is government, because an effective political system enables economic growth, first and foremost by establishing a government that can unify an economically relevant territory, establish order, and excuse me, protect the lives. Harrison, could you see if you get me some water? Lives, liberty, and property of the citizens through an impartial rule of law. I'm going to give you 3 examples: banking, manufacturing, and free trade, railroads. Beginning with our first Prime Minister, the recently much maligned Sir John A. Macdonald. A decade ago, Canada escaped the global credit crisis relatively unscathed. At the time, I heard serious people suggest it was because of the decision of the government in the late 1990s to block the big bank mergers. I thought, you can't be serious. Surely a much bigger factor was the disastrous performance of our banks and trust companies in the 1980s, which led to the creation of OSFI. That and the institutional memories of the older bankers who can remember how wrong they were about LDC loans fueled by petrodollars. But no, it goes well beyond that. We could talk about the housing policies developed in Canada during the Great Depression, but I think you have to go right back to 1864 and the period to 1871. In 1864, for a variety of reasons, a group of leaders from the British North American colonies got together, and first in Charlottetown and then in Quebec City, and they designed a federal system. Well, the Americans had done that recently. That was a model. But when you're designing a federal system, you get to choose what responsibilities will be federal and what will be local. And Prime Minister Macdonald had read the secret proceedings of the 1787 convention in Philadelphia. He'd marked, not annotated his copy. He was a great admirer of Hamilton, and he wanted banking as a federal responsibility. So a fundamental difference between our two countries is banking has always been a federal responsibility here, and it was otherwise in the United States. Last year, a well-known Canadian historian brought out his second volume on the Quebec City Conference, a day-by-day description, and he doesn't mention banking. Doesn't mention banking. How the hell I mean, that's just unbelievable economic illiteracy. In fact, this was brought to my attention in February when my colleague had just died. I was trying to get our book to bed, and somebody said, "Have you looked at this book?" So I said, "Oh my God, no, not one more thing to do." I looked at it, couldn't find any reference to banking. And then what as Confederation came to be, and the country, more particularly Ontario, was suffering major bank failures, and ministers of finance were dropping like flies. John A. Macdonald had the cabinet-making capability to get Sir Francis Hincks in as Minister of Finance, designed the Bank Act, the envy of the world, with the unique provision that by law the Bank Act would be reviewed every decade, and of course now that's down to 1890, every 5 years. Contrast that with our neighbor to our south, which seems to, we have 1907, and the National Monetary Commission is appointed, and they create a federal bank 7 years later. But the U.S. tends to react to crises. We anticipate crises. Manufacturing free trade. In spite of the rumored death of manufacturing in Ontario, I know it is not true, because my younger son is the Vice President of Technology for an Ontario manufacturer, and he has had the most positive outlook in our family of any of our children in the past 5 years. As a matter of fact, he's in Spain right now, not on a holiday, but on business. How's that? Get to go to Spain and business in Spain in September. It's more difficult to talk about free trade when you have in the U.S. a person who knows the Bible better, builds better walls, better supports veterans, is more in favor of equality, respects women more. The list goes on than anyone else in history. You will learn nothing by studying American history to help you understand Trump. Roman history may be better. Caligula or Nero. It will be a great test of the American system. How many? 10? Thank you. But let us assume that Congress will have some say. And then, as Lauren has already pointed out, decisions were made by MacDonald, tactical, not strategic. I'd always thought they were strategic until we wrote the case of Massey. As Sir Wilfrid Laurier said in 1911, need I remind the House once more that when Sir John Macdonald advised the Canadian people to adopt towards the United States a policy of high tariff, it was with a view to have a commercial convention such as was negotiated last year with the American Republic. And so while I was pleasantly surprised when Mr. Mulroney decided to go for free trade, I found he was accurate when he said, what you're talking about is a free trade agreement that Sir John A. Macdonald himself tried to get. And we should remember the heroes in this struggle, whether it was Cordell Hull, U.S. Secretary of State for FDR, or Donald MacDonald's Leap of Faith report in the early 1980s. Let's move on to railroads. They're not as important as they once were, but they're still important. At the turn of the 20th century, the CPR was twice the size of the Bank of Montreal, the largest bank, and we also had the Canadian Northern System. We had the Grand Trunk System. We all know the story because of Pierre Burton about CPR, but few know about the CNR's creation. Sir Wilfrid Laurier is one of my two favorite prime ministers in history, but he gets an awfully easy ride compared to John A. Macdonald. I mean, he commissioned 2 more transcontinental railways for a country with a population of 7 million. So what happened? The Canadian Northern System tripled, Grand Trunk increased by 40%. After the flood tide of railway construction came the inevitable penalty stage when first one railway and then another had to be bailed out by the taxpayer. And we'll all remember that the taxpayers continued to pay for it for nearly 8 decades. It is important that our voting public know how earlier decisions impacted business both for good and for bad. So, as Lauren has noted, successful economies depend on an interaction between public policy, financial system, entrepreneurs, and sophisticated managers in large corporations. Why then isn't there more business history taught? A basic reason, I think, is the lack of quantitative skills of people in history business. I know I prefer reading histories by geographers because they know they can add and subtract and do all kinds of things like that with numbers. Historians don't seem capable of doing that. And business history requires quantitative knowledge. In conclusion of this section, we need more history in our curriculum at every level. Room must be made for business history. And let me close with a small anecdote. As I was in the final stages of our most recent book, we'd been challenged by one of the reviewers by what happened in the failure of the home bank in the early 1920s. And there are many people in this room who have written books, and you know what it's like. They're all consuming. And I have my business library here and my political library at home, and I was sitting there thinking about the home bank. Now, for those of you who don't know the home bank, Prior to the 80s, it was the largest bank failure in Canadian history. It was a bank founded by the Roman Catholic Church for poor Irish immigrants who escaped the famine. And they were defrauded, and the officers and directors should have all gone to jail, in my opinion. One or two of them did. And so I said, well, look, that's terrific. I've got all my numerical data at the office. Let me check my political library. I took McGregor Dawson's classic biography of Mackenzie King and Levine's most recent biography of King, and guess what they had to say about the home bank failure? Anyone? Nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now let us turn to the other half of the equation, no history in business, nor in business schools. To me, it is pretty obvious why there is so little interest in history in business, and that is because of what I call the white painter syndrome. You get a brand new CEO, whether it's male or female, that's when history begins. So they white paint everything that was there before. And that's understandable. If you've seen the most recent surveys of arrogant workers, CEOs are second most arrogant workers in Canada. Who tops them?
Politicians.
Chefs. Well, what is good in business, I will suggest a variety of purposes, both in terms of management and in communication. Management should be able to use history for strategic purposes, for institutional memory, and for product development. Familiarity with a company's past helps management decide on its future direction, and I would contend that Red's example of CAE is as good as the one I was going to use for you about a property and casualty, U.S. property and casualty company I consulted to. Institutional memory is more important in bad times than it is in good. As a manager, I certainly wish I had had more experience with the downturn than I did when we entered the 82-83 recession. I quickly learned why auditors pay so much attention to balance sheets, especially cash. My focus at that point had always been on the P&L. Institutional memory is difficult to maintain given the rapid turnover and constant reorganization of modern business. Therefore, it is particularly important in all industries, but especially so in the commodity sectors, that it be structured in. Turning to product development, interestingly enough, Italian companies seem to be very good at using their museums for product development. One of the most interesting examples I ever had was working for a manufacturer in Oakville of vitrified clay pipe. Vitrified clay pipe has been in use since Roman days. But PVC came along, and, that's a pretty dramatic change. So what do you do for a manufacturer of a sewer pipe? Well, we looked at it. You can make other vitrified clay products, but that probably wouldn't be enough. So we said, well, sewers, get into garbage disposal. Your deposits are perfect, and they'll pass the Department of Environment. And corporate history can be used for communication purposes to customers, clients, to investors, employees, and even to politicians. In some ways, BMO has covered all three with its magnificent A Vision Greater Than Themselves, The Making of the Bank of Montreal, by Lawrence Musio, who is speaking here tomorrow. Excuse me. We at the CBHA hope to help the business corporate community, providing archival assistance and writing assistance. We want to preserve and present. We need your support for this initiative. Business schools, business history is not at all well established in Canadian business schools as it is in Japan and the U.S. and the U.K. Harvard established a business history program with a chair in the late 1920s. The first chair was a Canadian, and it was the Canadian-born dean of the Harvard Business School, John MacArthur, who integrated business history into the curriculum. There are now 19 historians at Harvard Business School. That is probably a multiple of all the business historians in Canada, whether they're in liberal arts or in business schools. In the UK, the Centre for Business History at the University of Glasgow is the best and most well-known, nearly as large as Harvard. In Japan, you probably have more business historians than the rest of the world, and in Europe, you have outstanding programs like at the Copenhagen Business School. In Canada, there's a paucity of business taught at business schools and at history departments and liberal arts faculties. What inspired me to suggest a business history program at Rotman. I'm not going to quote Santayana. The anonymous businessman, I thought, was a better quote, who said, I study business because I want to make my own mistakes. And let me tell you about the mistake I made around 1999-2000, because I was teaching part-time here, but I was doing a lot of other things, including being a director, and I was chairman of a data mining software company, Angos, a new generation of software solutions. And it got so crazy at the end of the century that for a brief period of time, my net worth was going up $250,000 a week. I come from a humble background. That was a lot of money. Guess what happened next? It was going down $250,000 a week. And I said, how could I have been so stupid? And so I went to the dean and I said, we need to teach our students context. We're doing a great job in strategy with Brian. We're doing a great job in finance with Paul. We're doing all these things. But we've got to give them some context. So, but having said that, right now it's difficult to be realistic on the topic. The prevailing pattern in the business schools is to be organized along functional areas, strategy, marketing, finance, etc. So what business history fit? What is its place? It takes an imaginative dean like John MacArthur to figure out and make it work. Throughout my career, I've always asked the question, why not, rather than why. Some people say, why are you doing it? I'd like to say, well, why don't we do it? The establishment of Canadian business history has been, for me, a quest, an impossible dream. I'm near the end, scorned and covered with scars. While I will strive with my last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable star, I will confess that I could sure use some help. Please join this crusade. Let us have business in history and history in business at the corporate and business school level. Thank you.